The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Zachary Ward sat beside Donald Watson on the worn leather couch, their shoulders nearly touching, the weight of unspoken words filling the space where conversation should have been. The apartment felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had drawn closer to witness this moment that had been building for months without either of them acknowledging it. Donald's hands rested on his knees, fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the denim of his jeans. He had been sitting there for nearly 20 minutes, saying nothing, just existing in the shared space as if gathering courage for something monumental. The television played softly in the background, some late-night movie neither of them was watching, casting flickering shadows across their faces in the dim lamplight. Zachary could feel the heat radiating from Donald's body, could sense the tension coiled in his friend's muscles like a spring wound too tight. Every breath Donald took seemed measured, deliberate, as if he was counting down to something. The familiar scent of his cologne mixed with something else, something that spoke of nervous anticipation and barely contained emotion. Zachary had memorized that scent over the years, the way it lingered on his clothes after Donald's visits, the way it made him feel both comforted and restless. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in a room where everything seemed suspended. Outside, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy, but inside the small apartment, the world had narrowed to just the two of them, and whatever was about to unfold between them. Then Donald turned, his dark eyes meeting Zachary's with an intensity that made the world tilt on its axis. The question came out in a whisper, barely audible above the hum of the television, but it might as well have been shouted from the rooftops for the way it crashed into Zachary's consciousness. "Do you ever think about us?" The words hung in the air between them, electric and dangerous, opening a door that neither could close once it was opened. Zachary felt his heart stop, then restart with a rhythm that seemed too loud in the sudden stillness of the room. Everything he had been hiding, everything he had been pretending not to feel, rose to the surface like a tide he could no longer hold back. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, how two best friends found themselves balanced on the precipice of something that could either destroy or transform everything between them, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. 3 months earlier, Zachary had been living what he thought was a perfectly ordinary life. He worked his 9-to-5 job at the marketing firm downtown, occupying a small cubicle on the 14th floor where he created campaigns for products he had no personal interest in. The work was steady, if uninspiring, and it paid well enough to afford his modest one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood where the rent was reasonable and the neighbors minded their own business. His days followed a predictable pattern. Wake up at 6:30, shower, coffee, commute, 8 hours of meetings and deadlines in the careful navigation of office politics, commute home, dinner, and then either an evening alone with a book or hanging out with Donald, his best friend since college. It was a comfortable existence, predictable in all the ways that made life manageable, if not particularly exciting. Donald Watson had been the constant in Zachary's adult life, the person he called when something good happened, the first one he turned to when everything went wrong. They had met during their sophomore year at university, thrown together as roommates by the housing department's random assignment system, and had somehow clicked in that effortless way that made it seem like they had known each other forever. Their first conversation had been about books. Zachary had been unpacking his collection, carefully arranging volumes of poetry and literary fiction on the shelf beside his bed, when Donald had walked in carrying a single box and wearing a grin that immediately put Zachary at ease. "Get one," Donald had said, gesturing toward the growing pile of novels. Quote 2. Zachary had replied, and Donald had laughed, a warm sound that would become one of Zachary's favorite things about his new roommate. "I read," Donald had assured him, "just not as much as I should. Maybe you can recommend something." That conversation had led to late-night discussions about everything from Hemingway to Murakami, from the philosophy they were both required to take to their completely different approaches to dating and relationships. Donald was a social sciences major with a natural charisma that drew people to him, while Zachary studied English literature and preferred small groups to large parties. Donald was everything Zachary wasn't. Where Zachary was quiet and introspective, Preferring to observe before speaking, Donald was outgoing and charismatic, able to walk into any room and immediately become the center of attention without seeming to try. Where Zachary preferred small gatherings and intimate conversations that could stretch late into the night, Donald thrived in crowds, drawing people to him like moths to a flame with his easy laugh and genuine interest in others. He had always been the one with girlfriends, the one who seemed to navigate relationships with an ease that Zachary envied but never questioned. Throughout college, Zachary had watched Donald cycle through a series of relationships that all seemed to follow the same pattern. There would be the initial excitement, the period of intense focus where Donald would talk about nothing but the new woman in his life, then a gradual cooling off that Donald could never quite explain. He would describe his girlfriends in glowing terms: beautiful, intelligent, funny, everything he thought he wanted. But there was always something missing, some indefinable quality that left him feeling empty even when he should have been happy. Quote 5. Donald had said during one of their late-night conversations senior year, after his latest relationship had ended in the same amicable but unsatisfying way as all the others. Quote, quote, yeah, Zachary had offered, though the words felt inadequate even as he spoke them. Quote on him, Donald had agreed, but he hadn't sounded convinced. Zachary, on the other hand, had struggled with dating throughout college and beyond. He went through the motions, asked women out when friends set him up or when social pressure demanded it, had a few relationships that lasted a couple of months before fizzling out in mutual disinterest. He told himself it was because he was picky, because he hadn't found the right person yet, because he was focused on his career and didn't have time for the complications of romance. The truth was something he had never allowed himself to examine too closely. The women he dated were nice enough, attractive and intelligent and kind, but there was never any spark, never that sense of connection that other people described when they talked about falling in love. He would go through the motions of romance, dinner dates, movies, the careful progression of physical intimacy, but it all felt performative, as if he was playing a role he didn't understand. The closest he had come to understanding what love might feel like was in his friendship with Donald. The way his heart would lift when Donald called, the way he looked forward to their evenings together more than any date he had ever been on, the way he felt most like himself when they were sitting together talking about everything and nothing. But those feelings were safely categorized as friendship, filed away in a part of his mind that he never examined too closely. The evening that changed everything started like so many others. Donald had shown up at Zachary's apartment around 7, carrying takeout containers from their favorite Thai restaurant and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he had news to share. It was a Friday night in early September, the kind of warm evening that made the city feel alive with possibility. They settled into their usual spots on the couch, Donald animated as he talked about his day, his latest project at work, the woman he had been seeing for the past month. His job at the consulting firm kept him busy, traveling to different cities to help companies restructure their operations, but he always made time for their Friday night dinners when he was in town. "Sarah's great," Donald said, spooning pad thai onto his plate with perhaps a bit more force than necessary. "Really great. She's smart, funny, beautiful, everything I should want in a girlfriend." Zachary noticed the emphasis on should, but didn't comment immediately. He had learned over the years to be a good listener when it came to Donald's romantic life, offering advice and support even when something deep in his chest twisted with each new relationship his friend described. There was always a part of him that wondered what it would be like to be the person Donald talked about with such enthusiasm. But he pushed those thoughts away before they could take root. "But," Zachary prompted, recognizing the tone in Donald's voice that suggested there was more to the story. Donald set down his fork and leaned back against the couch cushions, his expression growing thoughtful. He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture Zachary had seen countless times when Donald was working through something complicated. Zachary asked, though he thought he understood exactly what Donald was describing. Quote 14. Donald paused, searching for the right words. Quote 15. Quote 16. Zachary suggested, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. Quote 17. Quote 18. Donald agreed, but he didn't sound convinced. He was quiet for a moment, staring at the television screen without really seeing it, his food growing cold on the plate in his lap. "Can I ask you something?" Of course. Donald turned to face him fully, and there was something in his expression that made Zachary's pulse quicken. The question hit Zachary like a physical blow. It was too close to his own experience, too similar to the thoughts he had been pushing away for months, for years if he was honest with himself. The careful performance of heterosexual dating, the relationships that felt like elaborate charades, the growing sense that he was missing something fundamental about himself that everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. Code 22. He admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Donald turned to look at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through all the careful walls Zachary had built around his feelings. And there was something in his expression that Zachary had never seen before. Vulnerability, maybe, or a kind of searching that made Zachary's pulse quicken and his mouth go dry. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about what's real and what's just what we think we're supposed to want. The admission hung between them like a confession, and Zachary felt something shift in the foundation of their friendship. This wasn't just idle conversation or philosophical musing. This was Donald testing the waters, seeing how Zachary would react to the suggestion that he might be questioning fundamental assumptions about himself that he had never questioned before. They finished dinner in relative silence after that, the conversation having taken a turn that left both of them lost in their own thoughts. Donald stayed later than usual, lingering on the couch as if reluctant to leave. And when he finally did go, he hugged Zachary goodbye in a way that felt different somehow. The embrace lasted a few seconds longer than normal, and Zachary could have sworn he felt Donald's fingers tighten against his back before he pulled away. "I'll see you soon," Donald said at the door, and there was something in his voice that made it sound less like a casual goodbye and more like a promise. That night, Zachary lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every word of their conversation. There had been something in Donald's eyes, something in the way he had asked those questions, that made Zachary wonder if his friend was struggling with the same kinds of doubts that had been plaguing him for years. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, opening up possibilities that he had never dared to consider. Donald broke up with Sarah on a Tuesday evening in late October. He showed up at Zachary's apartment without warning, his eyes red-rimmed and his usual confident demeanor nowhere to be found. Zachary opened the door to find his friend standing in the hallway, looking lost and uncertain in a way that made Zachary's heart ache with the need to comfort him. Quote 25, Donald said without preamble, pushing past Zachary into the apartment. His clothes were wrinkled, as if he had been driving around for hours before finally working up the courage to come here. Quote 26, Zachary asked, closing the door and turning to face his friend. He could see the tension in Donald's shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Donald was pacing now, his hands running through his hair in agitation, leaving it messy and unkempt. Nothing happened. That's the problem. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly what it was supposed to be, and I felt absolutely nothing. I kept waiting to fall in love with her, kept thinking that if I just gave it more time, if I just tried harder, the feelings would develop. But they never did. He stopped pacing and looked at Zachary with an expression so raw and vulnerable that it took Zachary's breath away. Quote 29. Zachary said, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was apologizing for. The end of the relationship? The pain Donald was clearly feeling? The way his own heart had leaped with something that felt dangerously close to hope when Donald had said he was single again? Are you? Donald asked, and there was something in his tone that made Zachary look at him more carefully. Of course I am. You're hurting. Donald studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something specific in Zachary's expression. He said finally. Quote 33. They spent that evening on the couch, Donald's head resting against Zachary's shoulder as they watched mindless television. It should have felt natural, the way it always had when Donald needed comfort. But there was a charge in the air that made every point of contact between them feel significant. Zachary could feel the warmth of Donald's body pressed against his side, could smell his shampoo and the faint scent of his cologne, and had to fight the urge to turn his head and press his lips to the top of Donald's head. Donald seemed different that night, more vulnerable than Zachary had ever seen him. He talked about his fears of never finding love, about the growing suspicion that there was something fundamentally wrong with him that prevented him from feeling what other people seemed to feel so easily. Code 34, Donald said quietly, his voice muffled against Zachary's shoulder. Maybe I'm incapable of loving someone the way they deserve to be loved. You're not broken, Zachary said firmly, his hand coming up to stroke Donald's hair without conscious thought. Quote Myra, Donald asked, lifting his head to look at Zachary. The question hung between them, and Zachary felt like they were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. He could see the confusion and pain in Donald's eyes, could feel the weight of his own unspoken feelings pressing against his chest like a physical force. When Donald finally lifted his head to look at him, their faces were inches apart. Zachary could see the flecks of gold in Donald's brown eyes, could feel his friend's breath against his cheek. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, and Zachary thought Donald might lean forward, might close the distance between them and answer all the questions that had been building in the space between them for months. Instead, Donald pulled back, running a hand through his hair again in that gesture that had become so familiar. I should go, he said, his voice rougher than usual. You don't have to, Zachary said quickly, the words escaping before he could stop them. I mean, it's late. You could stay over. Take the couch like you used to in college. Donald looked at him again, and there was something in his expression that made Zachary's pulse race. Quote 43, Donald said softly. Quote 4, after Donald left, Zachary sat alone on his couch, his shoulders still warm from where his friend's head had been resting. The apartment felt empty without Donald's presence, hollow in a way that made Zachary realize how much of his happiness depended on these evenings they spent together. He found himself wondering what would have happened if he had been braver, if he had said something about the tension that seemed to crackle between them whenever they were alone together. But the fear of losing Donald's friendship, of destroying the most important relationship in his life, kept him silent. November brought a shift in their dynamic that was impossible to ignore. Donald started coming over almost every evening, often arriving with dinner or suggesting they cook something together. He would stay late, sometimes falling asleep on Zachary's couch and waking up in the morning looking rumpled and beautiful in a way that made Zachary's chest ache with longing. These mornings were torture and bliss in equal measure. Donald would emerge from the bathroom with his hair damp from the shower, wearing one of Zachary's t-shirts that he had borrowed, and Zachary would have to turn away to hide the way his breath caught in his throat. They would share coffee and whatever breakfast Zachary could cobble together, and Donald would talk about his dreams from the night before, his plans for the day, anything except the growing tension between them that seemed to thicken the air whenever they were in the same room. There were moments when Zachary caught Donald looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. During their conversations, Donald would sometimes trail off mid-sentence, his gaze dropping to Zachary's lips before snapping back up to his eyes with a startled awareness that left both of them flustered. These instances left Zachary feeling breathless and confused, wondering if he was reading too much into innocent gestures or if there was something more significant happening between them. The touches became more frequent too, and more lingering. Donald would rest his hand on Zachary's shoulder when he passed behind the couch, would brush their fingers together when handing him a coffee cup, would find excuses to sit close enough that their thighs touched when they watched movies. Each contact sent electricity shooting through Zachary's system, but he told himself he was imagining the way Donald seemed to seek out these moments of connection, the way his friends' breathing would change when their skin made contact. One evening in mid-November, they were cooking dinner together in Zachary's small kitchen when Donald asked a question that made Zachary's hands still on the vegetables he was chopping. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss another man? The question came out of nowhere, casual in tone, but loaded with implications that made the air in the kitchen feel thick and charged. Zachary's knife paused halfway through a carrot, and he could feel Donald's eyes on him, waiting for an answer. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of sizzling onions and the rapid beating of Zachary's heart. Quote 46. Donald continued when Zachary didn't immediately respond, his voice carefully neutral. Not in a weird way, just curious, like, do you think it would be different? Better? Worse? I was reading this article about sexuality and how it's more fluid than people think, and it got me wondering about things I've never really considered before. Zachary set down his knife and turned to face his friend, trying to read the expression on Donald's face. There was something there, a vulnerability mixed with curiosity, that made Zachary's heart race. Donald was stirring the sauce with more attention than it required, his cheeks slightly flushed in a way that could have been from the heat of the stove, but probably wasn't. Quote 48, Zachary said carefully, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Quote 49. Donald was quiet for a moment, stirring the sauce with mechanical precision. When he finally looked up, his eyes met Zachary's with an intensity that made the small kitchen feel even smaller. Lately, yeah, I've been wondering about a lot of things lately. The admission hung between them like a confession, and Zachary felt something shift in the foundation of their friendship. This wasn't just idle curiosity or philosophical musing. This was Donald testing the waters, seeing how Zachary would react to the suggestion that he might be questioning things about himself that he had never questioned before. Quote 51. Zachary asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Donald turned off the burner and faced him, leaning back against the counter. His hands gripped the edge of the countertop, knuckles white with tension. The words hit Zachary like a physical blow, dealing his breath and making his knees weak. He gripped the edge of the counter to steady himself, staring at Donald in shock. This was everything he had wanted to hear and everything he had been afraid to hope for, delivered in Donald's careful, measured voice that couldn't quite hide the tremor of uncertainty underneath. Quote 53. Zachary started, but found he had no words for the emotions flooding through him. Quote 54, Donald said quickly, as if he needed to get all the words out before he lost his nerve. He pushed away from the counter and took a step closer to Zachary, his dark eyes searching Zachary's face for some sign of how this confession was being received. I think about the way you make me laugh, the way you listen when I'm working through something complicated, the way you make me feel like the best version of the self, and I think about how empty I feel when I'm not with you, how nothing else in my life feels as real as these moments we share. How long have you been feeling this way? Zachary asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat. Months, Donald admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Maybe longer. I think I've been lying to myself for a while, trying to convince myself that what I felt for you was just friendship. But friends don't think about each other the way I think about you. Friends don't lie awake at night wondering what it would be like to hold you, to kiss you, to wake up next to you. The confession broke something open in Zachary's chest, and he found himself moving across the small kitchen without conscious thought. Donald's eyes widened as Zachary approached, but he didn't step back, didn't try to put distance between them. Instead, he seemed to lean into Zachary's proximity, as if he had been waiting for this moment as long as Zachary had. Zachary said, the words tumbling out in a rush. Quote 61. Donald's face crumpled, and he reached out to cup Zachary's face in his hands. Quote 16, quote 6, and Zachary said, leaning into the touch that he had dreamed about for so long. Quote 16, instead of answering with words, Donald leaned forward and pressed his lips to Zachary's in a kiss that was tentative at first, questioning, as if he was still seeking permission. Zachary responded immediately, his hands coming up to grip Donald's shirt, pulling him closer as the kiss deepened. It was everything Zachary had imagined and nothing like he had expected. Donald's lips were soft and warm, and he tasted like the wine they had been cooking with. The kiss was gentle but urgent, filled with months of suppressed longing and the wonder of finally giving in to feelings they had both been fighting. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Donald rested his forehead against Zachary's. His hands were still cupping Zachary's face, thumbs stroking across his cheekbones in a gesture so tender it made Zachary's eyes fill with tears. Both eyes, Donald started, then shook his head, apparently unable to find the words. Quote Sedao. Zachary agreed, understanding perfectly. They stood there for a moment, holding each other in the small kitchen. The dinner they had been preparing, forgotten on the stove. Zachary could feel Donald's heart beating against his chest, could see the amazement in his friend's eyes as he processed what had just happened between them. Quote 67. Donald admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 68. Zachary said, his hands coming up to cover Donald's where they still rested against his face. But I'm more scared of pretending this isn't happening. Donald smiled then, the first real smile Zachary had seen from him in weeks. It was radiant and uncertain and beautiful, transforming his face in a way that made Zachary's heart skip a beat. Zachary said honestly, Quote 72, quote saying to quote. They salvaged dinner, though neither of them was particularly hungry anymore. They sat at Zachary's small dining table, picking at their food and stealing glances at each other like teenagers with their first crush. The air between them was charged with possibility and the lingering taste of that first kiss, and everything felt different now, transformed by the admission of feelings that had been hiding in plain sight for so long. Can I stay tonight? Donald asked as they were cleaning up the dishes, his voice carefully casual, but his eyes betraying the vulnerability beneath the question. Of course, Zachary said, though they both knew this time would be different from all the other times Donald had slept on his couch. They moved through Zachary's evening routine together, brushing their teeth side by side at the bathroom sink, changing into sleep clothes with a new awareness of each other's presence. When it came time for bed, Donald hesitated at the threshold of the living room, looking toward the couch and then back at Zachary with a question in his eyes. You don't have to sleep on the couch, Zachary said softly, unless you want to. I don't want to, Donald admitted, but I don't want to assume anything either. You're not assuming, Zachary assured him. I want you to stay. With me. They lay together in Zachary's bed, not touching at first, both hyper-aware of the other's presence in the space that had always been Zachary's alone. The mattress dipped under Donald's weight, and Zachary could hear his breathing in the darkness, could feel the warmth radiating from his body across the small space between them. Zachary? Donald's voice was soft in the darkness. Zachary replied. Donald rolled onto his side, and Zachary could feel him looking at him in the dim light filtering through the bedroom curtains. Code 88. Instead of answering, Zachary turned toward him, and Donald's arms came around him immediately, pulling him close. Zachary settled against Donald's chest, his head tucked under Donald's chin, and felt something inside him relax that he hadn't even realized was tense. This was what he had been missing, he realized. This sense of rightness, of being exactly where he belonged. All those relationships that had felt like performance, all those dates that had left him feeling empty and confused, made sense now. He had been looking for something he could only find here in Donald's arms, in the space they created together. This feels right, Donald murmured against his hair, echoing Zachary's thoughts. Quote 90 him. Zachary agreed, pressing closer. They talked quietly in the darkness, sharing fears and hopes in the wonder of this new territory they were exploring together. Donald talked about his confusion over the past months, the way he had started questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. Zachary shared the loneliness of loving someone who didn't know they were loved, the careful performance of friendship when he wanted so much more. I kept thinking there was something wrong with me, Donald said, his fingers tracing patterns on Zachary's back. Zachary said firmly, quote 94, quote 95, Donald said. Quote 96, quote Zachary said. Quote, no, they fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other in Zachary's bed. And when Zachary woke up the next morning to find Donald still there, still holding him, he felt like he was living in a dream he never wanted to wake up from. The next few weeks were a revelation. They took things slowly, both of them navigating new territory with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Donald stayed over more often, and gradually the couch gave way to Zachary's bed, where they would lie together talking until the early hours of the morning, learning each other in ways they never had before. There were moments of doubt, times when Donald would pull back and wonder aloud if he was going crazy, if he was throwing away everything he thought he knew about himself for something that might not last. During these moments, Zachary would hold him close and remind him that love didn't always follow the rules society laid out, that sometimes the most beautiful connections were the ones that surprised you. I keep thinking about what people will say, Donald confessed one evening as they lay in bed together, his head on Zachary's chest. Zachary asked, running his fingers through Donald's hair. Does it matter what anyone else thinks as long as you're happy? It shouldn't matter, Donald said, but it's hard to let go of caring about other people's opinions, especially when those people are important to you. Your family loves you, Zachary said. Your real friends love you. That doesn't change because of who you're with. And if it does change for some people, then they weren't really your friends to begin with, Zachary said firmly. You can't live your life based on other people's expectations, Donald. You have to live it for yourself. Donald lifted his head to look at him, and there was something in his expression that made Zachary's breath catch. Quote 110 pound, he said simply. Quote 111. Zachary said, pulling him up for a kiss that was soft and sweet and full of promise. The transition from friends to partners wasn't always smooth. There were moments of awkwardness as they learned to navigate their new dynamic, times when old habits clashed with new realities. Donald struggled sometimes with the shift in his identity, with reconciling the person he had always thought he was with the person he was discovering himself to be. I don't know what to call myself, he said one evening as they were getting ready for bed, standing in front of Zachary's bathroom mirror as he brushed his teeth. What do I want to find out? Zachary wrapped his arms around Donald from behind, meeting his eyes in the mirror. Quote, he said. Quote, Donald leaned back against him, relaxing into the embrace. Quote 116 to him. Quote 117. Zachary said simply, pressing a kiss to the side of Donald's neck. The words still felt new and precious between them, something to be savored rather than taken for granted. Every time one of them said it, the other would light up as if hearing it for the first time, and Zachary thought he would never get tired of seeing that expression on Donald's face. They settled into a rhythm over the winter months, learning each other's habits and preferences in this new context. Donald was more affectionate than Zachary had expected, always reaching for his hand or finding excuses to touch him. He would rest his hand on Zachary's back when he passed behind his chair, would brush their shoulders together when they walked side by side, would curl up against Zachary on the couch even when there was plenty of room to sit separately. Zachary, who had always been more reserved, found himself opening up in ways he never had before, sharing thoughts and feelings he had kept hidden for years. Donald listened with the same attention he had always given to their conversations, but now there was an intimacy to it that made Zachary feel truly seen for the first time in his life. Their first fight came in February, over something small and stupid that escalated because they were both still learning how to be vulnerable with each other. They had been invited to a dinner party by some mutual friends, and Donald had made a comment afterward about Zachary being too quiet during the evening. Quote 118, and Donald said as they walked back to Zachary's apartment, I kept waiting for you to join the conversation, but you just sat there. I was listening, Zachary said, feeling defensive. Not everyone needs to be the center of attention. I'm not asking you to be the center of attention, Donald said, frustration clear in his voice. I just worry sometimes that you're not comfortable, that you're holding back because you think I want you to be someone different. I am holding back, Zachary admitted, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk. I've been holding back for so long that I don't know how to stop. I'm terrified that if I show you who I really am, you'll realize you made a mistake. The words hung between them in the cold February air, and Donald's expression immediately softened. He reached for Zachary's hands, pulling him closer despite the people walking around them on the busy street. You could never be a mistake, he said fiercely. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I don't want you to be anyone other than who you are. But who I am is quiet and awkward and not particularly interesting at parties, Zachary said, the insecurities he had been carrying for years spilling out. I'm not like you. I don't know how to charm a room full of people. I don't want you to charm a room full of people, Donald said, cupping Zachary's face in his hands. Quote 131. They worked through it, talking until the early hours of the morning about their fears and insecurities, about the ways their past experiences had shaped their expectations. It was the first of many such conversations, each one bringing them closer together, building the foundation of trust and understanding that their relationship needed to thrive. Quote 132, Zachary said as they finally settled into bed, exhausted from the emotional intensity of the evening. Year 33, quote 34. Donald said, pulling him close. Quote 35. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Donald's family was coming to visit for Easter, and he was nervous about how to handle their questions about his personal life. He had never brought a man home before, had never had to navigate the complex dynamics of coming out to family members who had known him his whole life. What if they hate me? He asked Zachary one evening as they planned for the visit, pacing around Zachary's living room with nervous energy. Quote 137. Zachary said with more confidence than he felt. Quote 138. Quote 139. Zachary stood up and caught Donald's hands, stopping his pacing. Then we'll deal with it together. But you can't live your life based on what other people might think. You have to live it for yourself. For us. I know that, Donald said, but his voice was tight with anxiety. It's just, they've been asking about my love life for years, wondering when I'm going to settle down and get married and give them grandchildren. How do I tell them that I've found the person I want to spend my life with, but it's not at all what they expected? You tell them the truth, Zachary said simply. You tell them that you're happy, that you're in love, that you've found someone who makes you want to be the best version of yourself. The details matter less than the fact that you're living authentically. The visit went better than either of them had expected. Donald's parents were surprised, certainly, and there were some awkward moments as they adjusted to the new information. His mother asked careful questions about how long they had been together, whether Zachary made Donald happy, if this was serious or just something Donald was exploring. But they could see how happy Donald was, could see the way he and Zachary looked at each other, the easy intimacy between them that spoke to a deep connection. Love won out over prejudice. Acceptance triumphed over expectation. Quote 145. Donald's mother said to her son as they were cleaning up after dinner, watching Zachary help Donald's father with the dishes. Quote 46, quote 47. Donald agreed, smiling as he watched Zachary laugh at something his father had said. Quote, "Word on me." Quote, "Word," she said, patting his arm. Quote, "Manmahi 150." Quote, 151. Donald said again, and the relief in his voice was palpable. Summer brought a deepening of their relationship, a settling into the comfortable rhythms of a couple who had found their groove. They moved in together officially, combining their belongings and their lives in ways that felt natural and right. Zachary's apartment became their apartment, filled with reminders of both their individual histories and their shared future. The process of merging their lives was both practical and emotional. Donald's books found homes next to Zachary's on the shelves, their different tastes creating an eclectic mix that somehow worked perfectly together. Donald's coffee maker replaced Zachary's ancient one, while Zachary's comfortable reading chair claimed a spot by the window where the light was best. They developed traditions and inside jokes, the kind of intimate shorthand that couples create over time. Donald would bring Zachary coffee in bed every morning, perfectly prepared with the exact amount of cream and sugar Zachary preferred. Zachary would leave little notes in Donald's lunch bag, sometimes silly observations about their morning routine, sometimes heartfelt reminders of his love. They had their favorite restaurants and their preferred spots on the couch, their own ways of communicating without words. A raised eyebrow from Zachary could convey volumes about his opinion of Donald's latest work story, while a particular smile from Donald could make Zachary's day regardless of what else was happening. I never understood what people meant when they talked about finding their person, Donald said one evening as they sat on their balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. I thought it was just romantic nonsense, something people said in movies but didn't really exist in real life. And now, Zachary prompted, reaching for Donald's hand. Quote when Donald said, intertwining their fingers. Quote one night, quote us, Zachary said, bringing their joined hands to his lips to press a soft kiss to Donald's knuckles. I can't imagine my life without you in it. They talked about the future more concretely now, about the house they wanted to buy, the trips they wanted to take, the life they were building together. It was a future that looked nothing like what either of them had imagined for themselves a year ago, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. The one-year anniversary of their first kiss came and went quietly, marked by a private dinner at home and the exchange of simple gifts that meant everything because of where they had come from. Donald gave Zachary a framed photo from the night they had first admitted their feelings, taken by Donald's phone when they had been cooking dinner together, both of them laughing at something Zachary had said. Zachary gave Donald a journal where he had written down all the moments over the past year that had made him fall even deeper in love. Small things mostly, the way Donald hummed while he cooked, the way he listened with his whole body when Zachary was telling him about his day, the way he reached for Zachary's hand without thinking whenever they walked together. Thank you, Donald said after reading the first few entries, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for seeing me so clearly, for loving all these little pieces of who I am. Thank you for being worth loving, Zachary replied. Thank you for taking the risk. They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that spoke to everything they had been through together. Everything they had overcome to get to this point. It was a celebration and a promise, a physical expression of the emotional journey they had taken together. As autumn returned, bringing with it the anniversary of Donald's breakup with Sarah and the beginning of his questioning, they reflected on how much had changed in their lives. The man who had once sat on Zachary's couch, confused and lost after ending a relationship that felt empty, was now confident in his identity and secure in his love for the person who had been there all along. "Do you ever regret it?" Zachary asked one evening as they walked through the park where they had spent so many evenings talking through Donald's confusion and fear. The leaves were changing colors, painting the world in the same shades of gold and red that had surrounded them a year ago when everything began to shift. Quote Wexton. Donald stopped walking and turned to face him, his expression serious. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face, but his eyes were clear and certain. Quote 165, he said firmly. Quote 166, quote 167, quote 168. Donald said, echoing the words he had spoken months earlier when he had turned down the job offer that would have taken him across the country. Quote 169, they continued their walk in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, both lost in their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them to this point. The path they had taken hadn't been straightforward, hadn't followed any conventional timeline or progression, but it had been theirs, and it had led them to a love that was deeper and more authentic than anything either of them had experienced before. As winter approached again, marking nearly 2 full years since that first conversation about feeling like they were living someone else's life, they found themselves back on the same couch where so much of their story had unfolded. The apartment looked different now, filled with the accumulated artifacts of their shared life, but the couch remained the same, a constant in their ever-evolving relationship. "I was thinking about that night," Donald said, settling beside Zachary with the same casual intimacy that had once sent electricity through Zachary's system, but now felt as natural as breathing. Quote, quote, when Zachary asked, though he knew exactly which moment Donald meant. Quote, quote, Zachary said softly. Quote, quote, Donald laughed, shaking his head in amazement. Quote, Zachary asked, turning to face him fully. Donald considered the question seriously, as he always did when Zachary asked him something important. He said finally, Zachary said, reaching out to touch Donald's face, "You're the partner I never dared to hope for." They kissed then, slow and sweet, a kiss that tasted of coming home and staying forever. When they broke apart, Donald rested his forehead against Zachary's, and they stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, existing in the same space, complete in a way that neither had ever been alone. Both Donald said quietly, quote, Ivan, quote, Zachary agreed, quote, Wisharlier, quote, Oyuan, and quote, Warninish. They spent the evening talking about their plans for the holidays, for the new year, for the decade stretching out ahead of them. They talked about the house they were going to start looking for in the spring, about the trip to Europe they were planning for their second anniversary, about all the ordinary and extraordinary moments they would share in the years to come. But mostly they just sat together, comfortable in the silence that had once been fraught with unspoken tension, but was now filled with the peaceful contentment of two people who had found their home in each other. As the night grew late and they prepared for bed, Donald caught Zachary's hand and pulled him close one more time. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft with emotion. "For what?" "For being patient with me, for loving me even when I didn't understand what I was feeling, for being brave enough to tell me the truth when I asked that question." "Thank you for asking it," Zachary replied. "Thank you for being brave enough to sit in that silence until you found the words." They had been living together for over a year now, and their life had settled into the comfortable rhythms of an established couple. Donald still brought Zachary coffee every morning, perfectly prepared and served in the mug that had somehow become Zachary's favorite. Zachary still left notes in Donald's lunch bag, sometimes silly observations about their morning routine, sometimes heartfelt reminders of his love that would make Donald smile in the middle of his workday. They had their favorite restaurants and their preferred spots on the couch, their own ways of communicating without words. The way Donald would absently reach for Zachary's hand when they were watching television, the way Zachary would rest his head on Donald's shoulder when he was tired, the way they moved around each other in their small kitchen like dancers who had been practicing the same routine for years. But there were still moments that took Zachary's breath away. Times when he looked at Donald and felt the same rush of amazement he had experienced that first night when his friend had asked if he ever thought about them. This was one of those moments, watching Donald read in the lamplight, his hair falling across his forehead in a way that made Zachary want to reach out and brush it back. The book was one of Zachary's recommendations, a novel about two men who find love in unexpected circumstances, and Donald was completely absorbed in it, occasionally making small sounds of surprise or pleasure as the story unfolded. The concentration on his face, the way he would sometimes pause to consider a particularly beautiful passage, the unconscious way he would reach for his coffee without taking his eyes off the page. All of it was so familiar and yet so wonderful that Zachary felt his heart swell with the same love he had been carrying for years. "What are you thinking about?" Donald asked, looking up from his book and catching Zachary staring. "Just you," Zachary said honestly. "Us. How different everything is now." Donald set his book aside and moved closer, settling against Zachary's side in the way that had become second nature to both of them. The movement was so natural, so unconsciously intimate, that it still amazed Zachary sometimes how easily they had fallen into this life together. "What do I want to go to mine in?" Donald smiled, pressing a kiss to Zachary's temple. "I used to lie in bed and wonder why I felt so empty after dates with women who were perfect on paper. I thought there was something wrong with me, that I was incapable of feeling the kind of connection other people talked about. I never imagined that the connection I was looking for was right there in front of me the whole time. Do you think we would have figured it out eventually if you hadn't asked?" "That question? I don't know," Donald said thoughtfully. "Maybe, but I'm glad we didn't have to wait any longer than we did. I'm glad I finally worked up the courage to ask." "I'm glad you did too." They fell into comfortable silence again, the kind of peaceful quiet that came from being completely at ease with another person. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season, and the apartment felt warm and cozy around them. The radiator hummed softly in the corner, and somewhere in the building, someone was playing music that drifted through the walls like a distant lullaby. "Zachary," Donald said after a while. "Yeah, I want to spend the rest of my life with you." The words weren't a proposal exactly, but they carried the weight of one. They were a statement of intent, a declaration of the future Donald envisioned for them. Zachary felt his heart swell with happiness, so intense it was almost painful. He said, his voice thick with emotion. Donald said, settling more comfortably against him. Quote 211, quote 212, as the snow continued to fall outside their window, they stayed curled together on the couch, reading and talking, and simply existing in the space they had created together. It was an ordinary evening in many ways, the kind of quiet night at home that might seem unremarkable to an outside observer. But for Zachary, it was perfect in its simplicity, a reminder of how much joy could be found in the everyday moments of a life shared with the right person. Later that night, as they were getting ready for bed, Donald paused in the bathroom doorway and looked back at Zachary with an expression of wonder that never failed to make Zachary's heart skip a beat. "What?" Zachary asked, recognizing the look. "I just can't believe this is my life," Donald said. "I can't believe I get to have this, to have you." "Believe it," Zachary said, moving to wrap his arms around Donald's waist. Quote 217. Donald leaned into the embrace and they stood there for a moment in the doorway, holding each other in the soft light of the bedroom. It was a moment that felt significant somehow, though Zachary couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe it was the way Donald relaxed completely in his arms, or the way the light caught the gold flecks in his eyes, or simply the overwhelming sense of rightness that came from being exactly where he belonged. The next morning brought the kind of lazy Saturday that they both treasured, with nowhere to be and nothing urgent demanding their attention. Donald made coffee while Zachary started breakfast, and they moved around the kitchen in the synchronized dance of two people who had learned each other's rhythms. "Could 208, Donald said as he set a mug of coffee beside the stove where Zachary was scrambling eggs. "Kolonon, quote 200. Zachary asked, smiling at the domestic picture Donald was painting. Quote 211. The casual way Donald talked about their future, the assumptions he made about their permanence, never failed to fill Zachary with a warm sense of security. There was no doubt in Donald's voice, no hedging or qualification. just the confident planning of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and where he was going. I'd like that, Zachary said. All of it. The house, the deal, the whole domestic dream. Good, Donald said, wrapping his arms around Zachary from behind and resting his chin on his shoulder. Because I've already been looking at listings online. They spent the morning browsing real estate websites, debating the merits of different neighborhoods and house styles. It was a conversation they had been having in abstract terms for months, but now it felt concrete, immediate. They were really going to do this, really going to build a life together in a space that was entirely their own. This one, Donald said, pointing to a listing for a small craftsman house with a fenced yard and a front porch. This one feels right. Zachary looked at the photos, imagining them in the bright kitchen, on the front porch swing, in the master bedroom with its large windows and hardwood floors. It was easy to picture their life in this space, to see Donald working in the garden while he read on the porch, to imagine lazy Sunday mornings in the big bed and dinner parties in the dining room. Let's call the realtor, he said. They spent the rest of the weekend making plans and dreaming about their future. By Sunday evening, they had scheduled a showing for the following weekend and started a list of everything they would need to do to prepare for the move. It was exciting and terrifying and wonderful all at once, this next step in their journey together. Are you nervous? Donald asked as they lay in bed that night, talking about the house and the changes it would bring. A little, Zachary admitted, but in a good way. It feels like the natural next step. It does, Donald agreed. Everything with us has felt natural, even when it was scary. Even that first night when I asked if you ever thought about us. It was terrifying, but it also felt inevitable somehow, like we were always going to end up here. I think we were, Zachary said. I think we just had to take the long way around to get here. I'm glad we did, Donald said, turning on his side to face him. I'm glad we had all that time as friends first. It makes this feel more solid somehow, more real. More real than what? Than anything I've ever felt before, than anything I thought was possible. They made love that night with a tenderness and passion that spoke to everything they had built together, everything they were planning for the future. It was a physical expression of the emotional journey they had taken, from friendship to love to this deep, abiding partnership that felt as natural as breathing. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Donald traced patterns on Zachary's chest with his fingertips. He said softly, "Get to 41." Zachary replied, the words as automatic and essential as his heartbeat. "Quote to 242." Donald said, lifting his head to look at him. Quote 243. Quote 12. Zachary said, reaching up to cup Donald's face in his hands. "You make me feel like I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." "We're good together," Donald said, leaning into the touch. "We are," Zachary agreed. "We're very good together." 3 months later, they were standing in the living room of their new house, surrounded by boxes and the chaos of moving day. The Craftsman house had been everything they had hoped for and more, with its original hardwood floors and built-in bookshelves and the kind of character that came from decades of other families making their lives within its walls. The morning had been a whirlwind of activity, with the moving truck arriving at dawn and a parade of friends helping to carry boxes and furniture from their old apartment to this new space that would become their home. Now, as the sun was setting and their helpers had gone home, they stood alone in their living room, taking in the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "I can't believe this is ours," Donald said, looking around at the space that was slowly becoming home. "I can't believe we actually did it," Zachary replied, though the disbelief was mixed with a deep satisfaction. They had made this happen, had taken the abstract dream of a shared future and turned it into concrete reality. The first few weeks in the new house were a whirlwind of unpacking and decorating, of learning the quirks of the old plumbing and figuring out the best spots for their furniture. But gradually the space began to feel like home, filled with their belongings and their routines and the comfortable rhythms of their shared life. They adopted a dog from the local shelter, a golden retriever mix named Charlie, who seemed to understand instinctively that he had found his forever family. The adoption had been Donald's idea, but Zachary had fallen in love with Charlie the moment they met him. And watching Donald play with their new pet in their fenced backyard filled Zachary with a contentment so complete it was almost overwhelming. Quote 251. He said one evening as they sat on their front porch, Charlie sprawled at their feet and the neighborhood settling into the peaceful quiet of dusk. Quote 252. Donald agreed to reaching for Zachary's hand. It's everything I never knew I wanted. The porch had become their favorite spot, a place where they would sit together in the evenings, watching the world go by and talking about their days. Their neighbors had been welcoming, bringing casseroles and introducing themselves with the kind of warmth that made them feel like they belonged in this community. Do you ever think about that night? Zachary asked. The night you asked if I ever thought about us? All the time, Donald said. It was the scariest and best decision I ever made. What would you say to yourself if you could go back to that moment? Donald considered the question, watching Charlie chase fireflies in the yard. I'd tell myself to trust the feeling, even if it doesn't make sense. I'd tell myself that love doesn't always follow the rules we think it should follow, and that's okay. I'd tell myself that the person sitting next to me on that couch is worth every risk, every moment of uncertainty, every difficult conversation with family and friends. And I'd tell myself to be brave enough to say what I was feeling instead of being so afraid of losing you, Zachary said. I'd tell myself that you were worth the risk too. We figured it out eventually, Donald said, squeezing his hand. That's what matters. We did, Zachary agreed, and look where it got us. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Charlie had tired himself out chasing fireflies and was now lying contentedly at their feet, the picture of domestic bliss. It was a scene that would have been impossible for either of them to imagine 3 years ago, but now it felt as natural and inevitable as breathing. I want to ask you something, Donald said eventually, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that made Zachary look at him more closely. What is it? Donald stood up and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Zachary's heart stop. Quote 268. He dropped to one knee on the porch, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band that caught the last rays of sunlight. Quote 269. The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Zachary was transported back to that night on the couch when Donald had asked if he ever thought about them. The same electricity, the same sense of standing on the precipice of something life-changing, the same mixture of error and joy. Quote 270, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Water 271. Donald slipped the ring onto his finger with hands that shook slightly, and then they were kissing. Right there on their front porch, with Charlie barking excitedly around their feet, and the neighbors probably watching from their windows. But none of that mattered, because they were exactly where they belonged, exactly who they were meant to be. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Donald rested his forehead against Zachary's in the gesture that had become their signature expression of intimacy. I love you, Donald said. I love you too, Zachary replied. Forever. Forever, Donald agreed. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they remained on their porch, holding each other and planning their future, and marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From that first tentative question to this promise of forever, they had traveled a path that neither could have predicted, but both knew was exactly right. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories, Zachary thought as he looked at the ring on his finger, are the ones that catch you completely off guard. Sometimes the person you're meant to spend your life with is sitting right beside you, waiting for one of you to be brave enough to ask the question that changes everything. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they ask it first.